Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 4 of my NES Retrospective. Today we're covering all the releases from 1989, which is about 63 releases, so still manageable enough to get through everything. I'm just going to go through the stuff that's not really that important quickly, but yeah, really spend some time on the games that are really notable. To get into it quickly, share and subscribe if you like my content, and check out my other retrospectives. And yeah, let's just dive right into it. A big year for the NES. The first game of the year is Data East Karnov. This is a port of the arcade platformer by Data East, starring their character Karnov, who would appear in other games, most notably as a boss in Bad Dudes. Next up is Renegade, a port of the influential arcade game Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun, developed by Technos. It's both the first game in the Kunio series, best known because of River City Ransom, and the spiritual prequel to Double Dragon. It's also known for influencing the entire beat-em-up genre. It was the first console game Technos developed, but unfortunately the NES version featured so many changes it bears little resemblance to the original version. Most notably, the graphics were changed from the traditional Kunio look to a more American street gang style, so it's not surprising if you didn't know this was a Kunio game. Which brings us to the first game in my collection, Konami's Contra. One of the best games on the console. It's a port of the arcade running gun, but is best known for its NES release. It features two-player simultaneous play, with the characters Bill and Lance making their way through 8 levels fighting back against alien invaders. There's also 6 weapon power-ups, including the fan-favorite spread shot. Stages consist of the side-scrolling platformer levels, and enemy bases with a unique behind-the-back perspective. Overall, just a ton of fun, one of the best two-player games on the console. Really hard, so use that Konami code, definitely worth checking out if you've never played it. Following that is Capcom's Gun.Smoke. This is a port of Capcom's Western-themed vertical arcade shoot-'em-up, where you control a cowboy walking through areas that can shoot diagonally or straight. It's interesting and pretty fun. Then is Town & Country Surf Designs' Wood and Water Rage. It's a game with skateboarding and surfing challenges named after the famous surfboard manufacturer. Following that is Dragon Power. This is the port of the first Dragon Ball Famicom game, which has had many changes during localization to remove the license, since Dragon Ball was pretty much unknown here at that time, though fans of the anime or manga will still recognize Dragon Ball elements all over it. Then is Nintendo's Ice Hockey. A decent hockey game to add to their sports lineup, but not really notable because of a game we'll get to in a bit. Following that is RC Pro-Am, a fun NES racer with an interesting perspective that made it stand out at the time. The game was developed by Rare before they got the pedigree they would earn for their Nintendo games. In it, the player races one of 4 remote control trucks around a series of tracks. The viewport is zoomed in, so only a portion of the track is visible at once. The game has 24 tracks, and players can collect items that improve the performance of their car, and some weapons to slow down other racers on the track. This one is a ton of fun. Next is Freedom Force, a port by Sunsoft of Nintendo's arcade light gun shooter, in which the player controls a sniper who goes through various stages taking out terrorists and saving hostages. Following that is Ikari Warriors 2 Victory Road. This is a port of SNK's arcade game, in which the Ikari Warriors fight against alien invaders, overall a way better port than the original game. Then is LJN's Major League Baseball, another baseball game, this time with the MLB license though. Then City Connection, a port of Jaleco's side-scrolling arcade game where you drive along 4 sets of platforms trying to cover all pieces of them while avoiding obstacles. Following that is Rambo, a game very loosely based on the Rambo movies that tries to copy the design of the Japanese Zelda 2, but has way too many design flaws to be good. Then we get to talk about one of the most notable beat-em-ups on the system, an amazing game, Double Dragon. This is a port of the arcade beat-em-up, but with enough changes to make it a very different game. This is likely the best known version and hugely influential for all beat-em-ups moving forward. The game has the player moving through each stage, punching and kicking enemies in order to take them out and progress. The NES features a unique system where you level up by hitting enemies and unlock new moves. It also features a 2-player one-on-one fighting mode where you can choose various characters to go up against each other, but it lacks the original 2-player option in the standard mode, which really does hurt it. Still a ton of fun and worth checking out. Following that, a terrible port of what should have been an amazing game and still alright, but yeah, really notable because it is the original NES Metal Gear. The top-down stealth action game was well received at the time despite being a pretty bad port of the original MSX version. It has translation issues that make it near impossible to finish with just the information in the game. The game puts the soldier Snake infiltrating an enemy base to rescue hostages and destroy Metal Gear, but this version doesn't actually have Metal Gear in it. The end boss is just some computer instead. You get a number of items and weapons throughout the game to help you progress, and notably you have to use different strategies to get around enemies without alerting them to survive. It's one of the first examples of a big stealth game instead of an action title, and yeah, it's not really worth checking out now because the MSX versions have been ported on different releases of Metal Gear Solid 3, but really worth looking into just to see how different it was. It's also worth noting that Metal Gear was put out by Ultra Games instead of Konami. So a lot of companies did this at the time. Nintendo had a rule that you could only put out so many games a year. That would keep a lot of the crap that ended up going on the Atari from happening to Nintendo. And so what companies did to get around this is they would create a second company and then put out games under that company as well. So for Konami it was Ultra Games. It's just an interesting thing to know. Following that is Tengen's R.B.I. Baseball. A good baseball game at the time, but more notable for being the first Tengen game on the system, and one of only 3 officially licensed games that the Atari-owned Tengen put out, before they learned to get around Nintendo's lockout chip and then put out all the rest of their games unlicensed. We'll cover that in future videos, but yeah, just know that this is the first game Tengen put out, they did it officially licensed, and it's actually a really good baseball game. Right after that, Bases Loaded, a completely different baseball experience and a much more realistic one, but a little less fun in my opinion. Then we get Defender 2, a port of the arcade game Stargate, which is a follow-up to Defender that takes the original formula and adds new enemies and a new Stargate warp. Next up, Gauntlet. Tengen's second officially licensed game. It's a port of Atari's arcade game, a top-down action game where 1 or 2 players each pick one of 4 characters with different strengths and weaknesses. They include the Barbarian, Wizard, Valkyrie, and Elf. You have to explore 100 maze-like levels, and in one really annoying feature, in order to complete the game you have to find 8 pieces of code in hidden treasure rooms. Next up is Iron Tank, a remake of the SNK arcade game Tank, which is the first game in the Ikari Warrior series. This update changes up things quite a bit and adds RPG elements like rescuing hostages for hints, collecting and switching between weapon types, and branching paths that you can take throughout the game. Next up is Capcom's legendary Wings, a port of their fantasy-themed arcade vertical shoot-'em-up where an alien supercomputer is attacking the world and 2 winged soldiers fight back. The game also features hidden side-scrolling areas that change up the gameplay a bit. Next is the shoot-'em-up. There's so many shoot-'em-ups for the console, I had to be really picky with what I kept in my collection, and this is definitely one worth checking out. It is Konami's Life Force. This is one of the more notable shoot-'em-ups on the console, and a port of Konami's arcade game Salamander, which itself is technically part of the Gradius series. Stages alternate between horizontal and vertically shoot-'em-up gameplay, with a power-up system that is similar to Gradius, where a player gets pickups that they can use for cheaper power-ups or store to unlock better ones, including pods called options. The game includes a 2-player mode, with the players controlling the Vic Viper and Lord British ships. And next we get to continue our story from last year as Nintendo officially releases the Power Pad. This is the rebranded version of Bandai's Family Fun Fitness Pad. In Japan, over the pad's life, Bandai launched 10 games under the Family Trainer series, and Nintendo would pick from those to release their Power Pad games. The first of the 5 they released in North America is bundled with the Power Pad. It's World Class Track Meet. World Class Track Meet is a track event style game featuring 4 events: the 100-meter dash, 110-meter hurdles, long jump, and triple jump. If that sounds familiar, it's because this is basically just a rebranded version of last year's stadium events. Everything but the title screen is exactly the same. This takes the rarest and most sought after NES release and creates one of the most common and cheapest games in the library. So while the original game is a holy grail for hardcore collectors, if you just want every unique game, you can consider Stadium Events as a variant of this and save the thousands of dollars it goes for and pick this up for like $5 instead. Also, I can't find any solid information on when Nintendo re-released Athletic World with the updated box and cart label, but I'm going to assume it was around this time too. Then a fun and notable platformer, Hudson's Adventure Island. The first in the series by Hudson Soft is a port of the Wonder Boy arcade game, and retains its gameplay but changes up its character to Master Higgins, who's arrived on the islands to save Princess Tina from an evil witch doctor. The game contains 8 worlds of 4 stages in which Higgins moves from left to right, avoiding enemies and obstacles to get to the goal. Each world ends in a unique boss fight against a form of the witch doctor. The player's health constantly drains, which is annoying, but picking up food replenishes it. Power-ups include the axe and torch weapons and a skateboard, which can be difficult to control but lets you travel much faster. The game is often compared to Mario Bros. Because of how few games like that were out at the time, but going back to it now, it's such a different game. I've never really liked that comparison and definitely worth checking out if you haven't seen it. Following that was Galaga, a good port of one of the most popular and successful arcade games of all time, and the game that popularized the vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up genre. Right after that, Golgo 13, Top Secret Episode. An action-adventure game based on the manga and anime sniper and contract killer Golgo 13. It combines side-scrolling areas, first-person mazes, and sniping segments. It's notable for the violent and sexual content that it managed to sneak through Nintendo's censors too. Right after that, Konami's Jackal. A port of the arcade top-down vertical shooter with a military theme that has the player controlling an armed jeep that moves through enemy territory, taking out enemies with guns and grenades while rescuing hostages. The arcade game in Japan had Jackal in the title, but here it was released as Top Gunner, so the NES version went back to the Japanese name. The game features 6 separate stages instead of the arcade's 1 long stage, and still has 2 players simultaneous play. Following that is Jeopardy, the first NES version of the popular TV trivia show. Then is Lee Trevino's Fighting Golf, a golf game by SNK that had Lee Trevino added to its name to make it appeal more to golf fans. Then is Milon's or Milon's Secret Castle. This is a frustrating platformer that relies on the player to discover passages hidden in the background to proceed. Basically, it's impossible without some sort of guide, and notable for most players, including myself at the time, renting it just to get stuck in the first couple rooms of the game. Then we get Wheel of Fortune. This is the first NES version of that popular TV game show. Following that is Xevious, a good port of the Namco vertical shoot-'em-up arcade game. You can shoot flying ships with your guns, or use your bombs to take down land targets throughout 16 stages. Then 1943, The Battle of Midway. This is the port of Capcom's arcade sequel to 1942, and overall a much better port than the original one. Like the first game, it's a vertical shoot-'em-up where you're controlling an Allied plane during World War II. Your plane also has a special lightning attack, and unique to the NES version is a system for upgrading your plane. You get some starting points to customize your plane, and then you can find hidden power-ups that permanently increase your plane stats by shooting invisible containers in each level. Next up is a combination cart, Donkey Kong Classics, which includes Donkey Kong 1 and 2 on it, which is great and why it was easy for me to get rid of those rare black box versions. Following that is Ghostbusters, a port of David Crane's game based on the movie that features some interesting ideas, but a terrible execution that makes it a frustrating experience. It's not even the best version of that much ported game, so not really worth knowing about here. Then Joust, a port of the classic arcade game that inspired Nintendo's Balloon Fight, which is still a great game, but yeah, there's tons of ways to check this out. And after that is MagMax. An interesting horizontal shoot 'em up where you control a little ship that collects top and bottom parts to become a big robot and blast your way through 4 levels at loop. If you take hits when in a bigger form, you'll lose a part of your robot until you can pick up new parts. Right after that is Mickey Mousecapade. A purple Capcom box game, but it's not really a game by Capcom. It's actually developed by Hudson Soft. It's an interesting mix of Mickey Mouse and Alice in Wonderland, with the player controlling Mickey and Minnie, who must move through 5 locations in Wonderland to save Alice. While the original Japanese version was much more themed with Alice in Wonderland stuff, including characters and enemies, the English version takes enemies from quite a few Disney animated movies instead. All of the bosses were changed between versions, most notably Maleficent is the final boss in this game instead of the Queen of Hearts. While this all sounds great, the gameplay is actually pretty rough, and it's just not that fun with some frustrating game design. After that, Millipede, a port of the classic arcade sequel to Centipede where you shoot up at a millipede coming down the screen at you. Another arcade port after that, Pac-Man. The third officially licensed Tengen game, and the first of 3 releases of Pac-Man on the NES, and it's okay. There's just so many ways to play Pac-Man now, it's not really special anymore. Following that is Racket Attack. A more realistic tennis game with better gameplay than the original NES tennis. It has 8 male and 8 female players to choose from. Right after that is Seicross, a horizontal shooter with a unique hover bike race kind of theme. And then Spy vs. Spy, the NES port of the one-on-one versus strategy game that was out on a ton of computer systems at a time. It's based on the Mad Magazine comic strip. The game has 2 spies racing to steal certain items from an embassy and get out first. The 2 spies can lay traps for each other throughout the building to stop each other from winning. Man, we're almost in October and I'm only halfway through my collection, so there are a ton of great games at the end of this year. Starting off with a huge release, Super Mario Bros. 2. It's fairly common knowledge now, but at the time, no players here knew that the game we got was not the same Super Mario Bros. 2 that was released in Japan. It was common around this time for sequels to be significantly different from the original, so there was not much debate around why this game was so different from the first one, but it was well loved by most players. This game that we know as Super Mario Bros. 2 is a localized version of Nintendo's Famicom Disk System title, Doki Doki Panic, which itself was a game designed to promote Fuji TV's Dream Factory 87 event, a month-long event celebrating Fuji TV's past and future for TV tech and TV shows. The game starred the 4 mascots of the festival as playable characters going through Arabian-themed levels. Each character had their own unique strengths and weaknesses. The original Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan was a tough, almost trolling new set of stages designed just like the original game. It was also considered too similar and too hard for the Western market, so Nintendo instead reworked Doki Doki Panic as Super Mario Bros. USA. There's a ton of minor differences I won't get into, but the game plays about the same. There are both horizontal and vertical scrolling areas that can make up stages. You can jump and pick up things to throw at enemies. This includes enemies that you can stand on and then grab them, root vegetables you can find along the ground, and bombs and blocks and other things like that. The goal is to get to the end of each stage and defeat the boss. Each of the 7 worlds have a different look and some elements that mix up the gameplay. There's also a bunch of secrets to find, and some almost puzzle-like elements to the game design. The original 4 characters were replaced with Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Peach. Mario was the middle-of-the-road character, Luigi could jump extra high, Toad could pull up objects and run faster, and Peach could glide through the air. The player picks a character at the beginning of each level, so that they could tailor their choice to the challenges in the stages they're about to play. This was released in Japan as Super Mario Bros. USA, and yeah, you didn't have to complete it 4 times like you did the original game to see the ending. It's a ton of fun and worth checking out. A lot of these elements have made it into the main Mario series, so it's pretty much canon. It's a good game and an interesting story. Following that is Anticipation, a board game-like video game by Rare that mixes a Trivial Pursuit style board with Pictionary style challenges. Then, kind of a classic cult hit, Blaster Master by Sunsoft. This classic NES title mixes side-scrolling action and top-down action segments. It's a massive plot change from the original Japanese version. The game stars a boy Jason who follows his pet frog down a hole to another world, where he finds and drives a mobile tank-like vehicle called Sophia the Third through 8 large levels. The levels are made up of side-scrolling areas to be explored, and at any point Jason could get out of his vehicle and proceed on foot to enter areas where the game switches to a top-down view. He moves through each interior area, taking out enemies and finding upgrades. The game's biggest critique is its difficulty, which in itself isn't that unfair. It's just that the game is long and features limited lives and continues with no password or save system. And after that, Michelle's absolute favorite retro game, Bubble Bobble. This is a port of Taito's unique action puzzle platformer that stands out from many other arcade ports on the NES because it's an essential 2-player co-op experience on the system. The game has the players controlling the monsters Bub and Bob, who can spit out bubbles to trap enemies and then must pop them to defeat them before they break out. The goal is to take out the enemies on every stage in order to move on to the next. There's a number of different techniques to use and bubbles that unleash special attacks when popped that are needed to clear each of the puzzle-like stages. There are over 100 stages in the game and a final boss, as well as different versions of every stage for a second playthrough. A password system thankfully lets the players continue their progress. Following that is Cobra Command, a port of Data East's helicopter arcade game that's similar to Choplifter. Then, Dr. Chaos. This is a really interesting concept that's similar to last year's Goonies 2, but with a bad execution. It's almost an early survival horror title, with the player exploring a large mansion filled with monsters, that plays like a side-scrolling action game, and then has rooms that you explore in first person with a point-and-click-like interface. You find items to progress, as well as bullets for your guns and grenades. I really wish this was as good as it sounds. And then we get the NES Action set. This is the big set, the big release that I think most kids had. The price dropped, a lot of parents then picked it up for this holiday season. I don't think this is the official release. I know that I got rid of my box when I was a kid and got one. I was really young at the time, but I'm pretty sure mine came with a gray gun, which is why I think that, the orange gun was re-released later. But yeah, a great set that a lot of people who got it back then will have fond memories of. It was released in November of 1988 and replaced the original 2 bundles. It comes with 2 controllers, the Zapper, and a combo cart that includes Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt. The inclusion made Super Mario Bros. The best-selling game of all time for quite a while. It was a title that it basically kept for decades until Wii Sports. The action set was priced at $150, which was $50 less than the previous control deck. So with the added 2 games and Zapper as a bonus, it was the real tipping point for NES sales. And yeah, this set is where we got the Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt combo cart, the most common NES game ever released, but some resellers will still try to get a good amount for it, which is pretty crazy because really there are so many of these out there. Which brings us to Super Team Games, the 3rd family trainer game to be released in North America for the Power Pad. It's a summer camp style event game with 7 mini events making up 3 obstacle courses, as well as a separate skateboarding race event. The event can be played with 1 or 2 players, and the game also includes unique events for 6 players, with 3 on each half of the pad. These are Tug of War, a 6-legged race, and relay races. And then another sequel to a huge series, Zelda 2: The Adventures of Link. This follow-up to The Legend of Zelda is kind of the black sheep of the series, but one I loved. It changes up the gameplay a lot from the original, and leans heavy on new RPG elements and side-scrolling action gameplay. The game takes place after the original, with Link trying to return crystals to 6 palaces in order to wake up Princess Zelda's ancestor, who's been frozen in a deep sleep for centuries. She's also confusingly named Princess Zelda. Meanwhile, Ganon's followers are trying to kill Link to perform a ritual that'll bring Ganon back to life. The game features a top-down overworld that's more like the world map from an RPG. Enemies spawn on the map and move towards Link, and if they come in contact with him, the game switches to a side-scrolling view where Link must attack or escape the enemies. Once getting to a town, cave, palace, or other area, the game uses a side view for Link to explore. Link can move around, jump, duck, and attack. Standing or ducking lets you make sure Link's shield can block enemy attacks and is a huge part of the gameplay, as well as positioning him correctly to hit enemies. As Link defeats enemies, he'll gain experience and eventually level up. With each level, the player can choose to increase either his HP, MP, or strength. There's also containers found around the world which can offer permanent HP or MP increases. Link must also find a number of items and tools that give him new abilities and help him progress through the game. He can also learn a number of spells. Lastly, the game has one of the earliest examples of a New Game Plus mode, where you can carry over your level, attacks, and spells, but start the game over. Like the original game, this was later re-released as a Classic Edition variant with a different box design and a standard NES Grey cart. Following that, a big cult title by Capcom, Bionic Commando. This is a port of the arcade game that was titled Hitler's Revenge Top Secret. Like I said, it's a cult classic NES game that's way better known than the original NES version. The game stars Lad Spencer, who's infiltrating an enemy base in order to rescue the captured Super Joe, who was the main character in Capcom's previous game Commando. Along the way, he learns of a Nazi plot to resurrect Hitler and has to stop it, leading to a really memorable ending. The English version did make some changes for obvious reasons. They changed up the names and removed the Nazi imagery to make it a bit more vague, but it's still pretty obvious. Gameplay is similar to the original arcade game, but the structure is quite a bit different, with the player able to choose the next stage on the map screen instead of just going through the arcade's 4 levels. The map allows the player to go back to previous stages and contains 22 areas to move around through. In each stage, the player explores an open world trying to get through or complete specific objectives. You can shoot, but you can't jump, which really throws off a lot of newcomers to the game. Instead, you use your grappling arm to connect to areas above you, to climb up or swing to get around. It takes some getting used to, but it's a ton of fun and something really different for a platformer. Following that, I don't have many sports games, but one I will always keep is Konami's Blades of Steel. This is still my favorite hockey game. With this game, Konami gives hockey the same treatment they gave basketball with Double Dribble. The gameplay is fun and fast, and it includes different gameplay for fights and shootouts. There's a big focus on presentation, including a mini shoot-'em-up and a small animation between periods. Following that is Bump and Jump, a port of Data East's vertical arcade driving game where the car can jump. And yeah, an amazing year because we had Mario 2, we had Zelda 2, and now we are getting Castlevania 2, which is very much like Zelda 2. Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest changes up things a lot from the original game. Instead of being a linear stage-based action platformer like the first game, Simon's Quest takes the basic gameplay and moves it into a side-scrolling open world, with several towns where you can get information and purchase new items and weapons. The story takes place several years after the original game, where Dracula's defeat has placed a curse on Simon, and he has to go around Transylvania collecting parts of Dracula in order to burn them and remove the curse. The game uses an XP system where you level up and get stronger by defeating enemies, a day-night cycle where the world is more dangerous at nighttime, and multiple endings depending on how long the player takes to beat the game. Unfortunately, the game is confusing and contains puzzles that are nearly impossible to solve with all the fake information given in the game. And that really turned off a lot of players. Which is a shame because if you can look past that and maybe use a walkthrough, it's such an ambitious and interesting game, and basically a precursor to the open world Castlevania games like Symphony of the Night and Order of Ecclesia. So yeah, not well loved, there's been some ROM hacks that make it much more playable, but I still really dig it and the music is incredible. And following that is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The secret 4th licensed Tengen game, but this time they made a deal with Mindscape to publish it for some reason. It's a maze-like action-adventure game inspired by the second Indiana Jones movie that is confusing and frustrating, so I don't recommend it. Then is Othello, a version of the popular Japanese board game Go. And Paperboy, a port of the arcade game in which the player moves up a street throwing newspapers into subscribers' mailboxes or breaking non-subscribers' windows while avoiding all kinds of obstacles. Each level is a day in the week and ends in a bonus obstacle course. Then is Platoon, a decent but frustrating game based on the Oliver Stone Vietnam War movie. It features 4 stages with completely different playstyles, including side-scrolling action, a maze-like jungle, first-person dungeon crawler, and a vertical shooter. And another one of Michelle's favorite games, another amazing 2-player game for the NES, Rampage. This is a port of the arcade game in which 3 giant monsters controlled by players destroy a city building by building. The players can be damaged by the attacking army, falling too far, and eating things that hurt them, but can also gain life by eating people on the ground or in windows in the buildings. The wolf monster was removed for the NES version, allowing players 1 and 2 to play as either the King Kong-like George or the Godzilla-like Lizzie. Following that is Robowarrior. Known as Bomber King in Japan, this is the first spin-off of the Bomberman series. It takes that classic gameplay but does something completely different with it. The game stars the Robowarrior, a decommissioned combat robot who takes it on himself to save the humans on a colony planet from the invading empire. The game includes 27 stages which feature different themes, goals, and obstacles. In each stage, the Robowarrior moves through a maze-like level, blowing up obstacles to make a path through and using his weapons and power-ups to take out enemies. Next up is Skate or Die, a skateboarding game made up of a number of different minigames, most notably the half-pipe one, which is the best part of a fairly mediocre game. Then Superman, a notably strange side-scrolling adventure game that's just overall a bad representation of the character and not that fun. And the last game of this retrospective is Xenophobe, a port of the sci-fi split-screen co-op arcade game where you have to kill all the enemies in a space station before time runs out. The NES version features 2 players at a time instead of the 3 that the arcade version did, and each player has their own half of the screen even though they're both in the same game world. There are 8 levels, made up of 8, 16, 24, or 32 rooms each. Rooms contain aliens to take out as well as item and weapon power-ups. And so yeah, that's all the games for the NES of 1989. I haven't said this since the first video, so I feel like it's worth saying. The dates here are all over the place. No one really kept track of exactly when games came out, and I guess you really couldn't because they were shipped to different places at different times. So we just have the months to go by. I try to do these in chronological order, but you know, they may not be exact. In fact, they're probably not, but I think it's close enough. So yeah, thanks for checking out this retrospective. I'm going to get on to 1990 at some point in the new year. I have lots of other retrospectives I'm working on. I'm doing the 2018 one soon, so check all those out. Yeah, thanks for checking us out. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.